On the morning of April 7, 1943, at 11:27 a.m., First Lieutenant James Elm Sweat climbed into the cockpit of his Grumman Wildcat fighter over Guadalcanal, watching the sky darken with over 150 Japanese dive bombers approaching Tulagi Harbor. At 22 years old, he was a Marine Corps Reserve pilot with 0 confirmed kills, facing the largest enemy air raid in the Solomon Islands since Henderson Field fell under siege 6 months earlier. His squadron mates called him the Rookie, a former civilian pilot from California who'd earned his wings through the civilian pilot training program, never firing his .650 caliber machine guns in anger. When radar operators spotted the incoming Japanese formation that morning, VMF 221 scrambled every available fighter, but Sweat's 4-plane division was ordered to intercept alone. 4 Wildcats against an armada of Aichi dive bombers protected by 0 fighters, all part of Operation Wine-Go, Japan's desperate attempt to crush Allied supply lines in the Solomons. His commanding officer had briefed the squadron on what everyone already knew. The Wildcat was slower than the Zero, couldn't climb like the Zero, and got shredded in dogfights against experienced Japanese aces. Standard doctrine called for hit-and-run tactics, strike once and disengage, never get trapped in a turning fight, avoid the bomber's defensive formations at all costs. As Sweat pushed his throttle forward and felt his Pratt & Whitney radial engine roar to life, oil streaking back across his windscreen from the morning's pre-flight, he could see the first wave of Vals beginning their attack dives on Allied ships anchored in Tulagi Harbor, their bombs glinting in the tropical sun. His wingmen radioed that they were separating to engage the fighter escorts, leaving Sweat alone with a simple choice: follow doctrine and wait for backup, or dive straight into the heart of the bomber formation by himself. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most dangerous enemy isn't the one with experience, it's the one with nothing left to lose. The radio crackled to life at 0630 hours on April 7th, 1943, cutting through the humid dawn air that hung over Henderson Field like a wet blanket. James Elm Sweat had been awake for 20 minutes, sitting on the edge of his cot in the tent he shared with 3 other Marine pilots, watching condensation drip from the canvas ceiling onto his flight boots. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Colonel William Pace, commanding officer of VMF 221, and his words carried the clipped urgency that meant business. All pilots to ready room. Immediate brief. This is not a drill. Sweat pulled on his khaki flight suit and walked across the coral dust that passed for a runway, past the revetments where ground crews were already hauling fuel drums toward the line of F4F4 Wildcats. The morning smelled of aviation, gasoline, hot metal, and the perpetual jungle rot that clung to everything on Guadalcanal. He had arrived on the island just 3 weeks earlier as part of the squadron's rotation from Espiritu Santo, carrying his flight logbook with its neat entries documenting 247 hours of flight time, all of it stateside, all of it peaceful. The other pilots called him college boy, sometimes rookie, never with malice but always with the subtle distance reserved for untested men in a place where experience measured survival in minutes. Inside the operations tent, Pace stood before a hand-drawn map of the Solomon Islands chain, his weathered face grim under the harsh light of a gasoline lantern. Intelligence reports increased Japanese air activity over the past 72 hours, he said, tapping the map with a wooden pointer. Staging from Rabaul, Bougainville, and Buka, photo reconnaissance shows at least 80 enemy aircraft assembled at forward bases. We expect a major strike today. Sweat studied the faces around him. 18 pilots, most of them veterans of the Guadalcanal campaign that had officially ended in February but continued to bleed men and machines in daily skirmishes. Captain Joseph Foss sat in the front row, his 26 confirmed kills making him the squadron's unofficial ace of aces. Next to him, Lieutenant Robert Hansen cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife, projecting the casual indifference that came with surviving 4 months of combat. These men had fought through the desperate days of August and September, when Henderson Field changed hands nightly, when pilots slept in their cockpits, and mechanics worked by moonlight to keep fighters operational. The Japanese are calling it Operation Igo, Pace continued. Admiral Yamamoto's personal pet project. Intelligence estimates 150 to 200 aircraft in the initial wave, Vals, Kates, and Zero escorts. Primary targets appear to be shipping in Iron Bottom Sound and our logistics facilities at Tulagi. Sweat felt his stomach tighten. He had read the intelligence reports, studied the tactical manuals, memorized the silhouettes of enemy aircraft until he could identify them from any angle. But reading about the Aichi D-3A dive bomber was different from watching it fall out of the sky with a 500-pound bomb aimed at your position. The Wildcat he would fly that morning, Bureau number 12084, had been delivered to VMF 221 in March, factory fresh from Grumman's Bethpage plant. 6 Browning AN-M2 50 caliber machine guns, 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 total. The arithmetic was simple. Each gun fired at roughly 800 rounds per minute, meaning he could empty his ammunition supply in approximately 3 minutes of continuous firing. The reality was more complex. Combat pilots fired in short bursts, 1 to 3 seconds, to maintain accuracy and conserve ammunition. A skilled pilot could make his guns last through multiple engagements if he chose his shots carefully. The briefing continued with weather reports, radio frequencies, and recognition signals, but Sweat found his attention drifting to the mechanical details that grounded his nervousness in familiar territory. His Wildcat weighed 9,135 pounds fully loaded, powered by a Pratt & Whitney R18-3086 twin Wasp radial engine, producing 1,200 horsepower. Maximum speed was 318 miles per hour at 19,400 feet, service ceiling 34,800 feet. The numbers represented months of training, hundreds of hours in the cockpit learning how the aircraft responded to control inputs, how it behaved in different flight regimes. Division leaders will take off at 0800 for routine combat air patrol over the Russell Islands, Pace announced. Maintain radio discipline. Report any contacts immediately. We'll have radar coverage, but assume the Japanese will try to jam our frequencies. After the briefing, Sweat walked to his aircraft where Staff Sergeant Mike Cowlock, his crew chief, was supervising the pre-flight inspection. Cowlock had arrived on Guadalcanal in August with the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, surviving malaria, dysentery, and more air raids than he cared to count. His hands moved over the Wildcat's engine, cowling with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that a pilot's life depended on properly torqued bolts and clean fuel lines. "Oil levels good, Lieutenant," Cowlock reported. "Ammunition belted and checked. Radio's working, but the frequency selector's a little sticky on channel 3. Just work it gentle-like." He paused, studying Sweat's face with the frank assessment of an experienced non-com. "First time going hunting?" "Yes, Sergeant." "Listen to your wingman. Don't get separated from the division. And remember, the Zero's faster and climbs better, but your Wildcat's got more firepower and can take more punishment. Use that." Cowlock's advice carried the weight of men who had learned these lessons through bitter experience, watching friends disappear into the jungle or simply fail to return from patrol. At 0750, Sweat strapped himself into the cockpit and began his engine start checklist. The Wildcat's controls felt familiar under his hands: throttle, mixture, propeller pitch, landing gear, flaps, gun sight, radio. He had practiced these procedures hundreds of times, but never with the knowledge that enemy aircraft might be climbing toward an intercept course 60 miles away. The engine caught on the second attempt, settling into the distinctive rumble of a properly tuned radial. Around him, 3 other Wildcats were coming to life, their Hamilton standard propellers kicking up clouds of coral dust that caught the morning sunlight. The takeoff was routine, 4 aircraft lifting off Henderson Field's pierced, steel planking and climbing southeast toward the Russell Islands. Sweat flew as division leader, his wingman, 2nd Lieutenant Roy Rushton, maintaining loose formation off his right wing. The other section, led by Captain William White, flew step down and slightly behind. Standard 4-plane division tactics, designed to provide mutual support while maintaining visual contact with all aircraft. At 10,000 feet, the air was cooler and cleaner, free of the oppressive humidity that made ground life miserable. Sweat could see for miles in every direction, the dark blue of Iron Bottom Sound, the green jungle of Guadalcanal stretching toward the mountains, the scattered coral atolls of the Russell Islands chain where they would establish their patrol pattern. This was the part of flying he had always loved, the sense of freedom that came with leaving the Earth behind. But today carried a different weight. Today, the empty sky might suddenly fill with enemy aircraft, and everything he had learned in training would be tested by men who had been fighting this war since Pearl Harbor. The radio crackled with routine position reports and weather updates, but underneath the professional calm, Sweat could hear the tension. Every pilot on the frequency knew that somewhere to the north, Japanese air crews were climbing into their cockpits, running through their own pre-flight checklists, preparing for the largest air raid in the Solomons since the desperate days of October. The question was not whether they would come, but when, and whether VMF 221 would be in position to stop them. At 11:26 hours, the radar station at Henderson Field reported multiple bogies bearing 320 degrees, range 80 miles, and closing fast. The transmission crackled through Sweat's headset with the mechanical precision of men who had delivered similar warnings dozens of times over the past 8 months, but never for a formation this large. All Cactus fighters, this is topside. We have a very large raid inbound. Estimate 100 plus bandits. Vector 090 degrees, Angels 20. This is not a drill. Sweat banked his Wildcat northwest and advanced his throttle to military power, feeling the Pratt & Whitney engine respond with a surge that pushed him back into his seat. The four-plane division climbed through 15,000 feet, then 18,000, the thin air making his engine work harder for each foot of altitude. Below them, Tulagi Harbor spread out like a tactical map, its anchorage crowded with Liberty ships, destroyers, and the converted destroyer transports that kept the Solomon Islands supplied with ammunition, fuel, and replacement personnel. Those ships represented the entire Allied logistics chain in the South Pacific, and Sweat understood with crystalline clarity that if the Japanese succeeded in sinking them, every Marine and soldier on Guadalcanal would be stranded without resupply. At 20,000 feet, he spotted them first as a dark smudge on the northwestern horizon, a formation so large it looked like a weather front moving across the sky. As the distance closed, the smudge resolved into individual aircraft, tight formations of Aichi D-3A dive bombers with their distinctive fixed landing gear, escorted by Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters, flying protective weaves above and beside the strike package. Sweat counted at least 60 bombers in the leading elements, with more formations visible behind them. The Japanese had committed virtually their entire available air strength to this single attack. Tally ho, tally ho, Captain White's voice came through the radio with forced calm. Large formation of Vals and Zeeks, bearing 330, Angels 18, 4 divisions minimum. The tactical situation crystallized in Sweat's mind with the clarity that came from months of training. His 4 Wildcats faced odds of at least 30-1, and standard doctrine called for immediate withdrawal to gather reinforcements. But the Japanese formation was already beginning its attack approach on Tulagi Harbor, and there was no time to coordinate with other squadrons or wait for additional fighters to climb to intercept altitude. The lead Japanese bombers began their approach to the target, flying in tight 3-plane Vics that maximized their defensive firepower while maintaining formation discipline for the attack dive. Each Aichi carried a single 250-kilogram bomb plus 60-kilogram wing-mounted ordnance, enough explosive power to cripple a destroyer or sink a transport vessel. The bomber's rear gunners, naval aviation petty officers armed with Type 92 7.7mm machine guns, tracked the approaching Wildcats with the professional competence of men who had survived previous raids on Port Moresby, Darwin, and Rabaul. Sweat made his decision in the span of heartbeats that separated tactical analysis from action. The Wildcat's strengths lay in its rugged construction, heavy firepower, and diving capability. Its weaknesses were speed, climb rate, and maneuverability compared to the Zero. Fighting the escort fighters would play to Japanese advantages while allowing the bombers to complete their attack unmolested. But attacking the bombers directly would exploit every advantage his aircraft possessed, while fulfilling his primary mission of protecting Allied shipping. White Flight, this is White 1, he transmitted. I'm going after the bombers. Engage the escorts. Without waiting for acknowledgement, he rolled his Wildcat into a steep diving turn that brought him down and behind the lead bomber formation. The dive gave him a significant speed advantage. His airspeed indicator climbed past 350 miles per hour as gravity supplemented engine power. More importantly, the attack angle minimized his exposure to defensive fire while positioning him for deflection shots at the bomber's most vulnerable areas. The first Aichi filled his gun sight at 400 yards range, growing larger with each second as his dive steepened. Sweat could see details now, the bomber's mottled green and brown camouflage, the red Hinomaru national marking on its wings, the rear gunner swiveling his weapon to track the approaching Wildcat. He pressed his trigger at 300 yards, feeling his aircraft shudder as all 650 caliber machine guns opened fire simultaneously. The sound was distinctive even through his leather flight helmet, a deep rhythmic hammering that pilots compared to ripping canvas. His first burst lasted 2 seconds and consumed approximately 160 rounds of ammunition. The tracers, every 5th round in the belt, drew bright lines through the air that converged on the Val's engine compartment. 50 caliber bullets struck the bomber's radial engine with devastating effect, punching through aluminum cowling and into the complex machinery of cylinders, pistons, and fuel lines that kept the aircraft airborne. Black smoke began streaming from the engine nacelle, followed by orange flames as aviation gasoline ignited. The bomber's pilot, a naval aviation flight petty officer with 18 months of combat experience, attempted to maintain formation discipline even as his aircraft began its death spiral. But the Nakajima Sakai radial engine was mortally wounded, its power output falling rapidly as internal components seized and fuel lines ruptured. The Aichi rolled slowly to the right and began a steep descent that would end in Iron Bottom Sound 30 seconds later. Sweat pulled out of his attack dive and immediately acquired a second target, another Val flying in the same three-plane element. His altitude advantage was gone now, consumed in the attack, but his speed remained high, and the bomber formation was beginning to spread out as individual aircraft commenced their attack dives on the shipping below. He maneuvered for another stern approach, conscious that his ammunition supply was finite and each engagement had to count. The second engagement followed a similar pattern, a high-speed approach from the bomber's rear quarter, a burst of .50 caliber fire at close range, and the immediate devastating effect of heavy machine gun bullets on aircraft structure. The Val's starboard wing folded upward at an impossible angle as armor-piercing incendiary rounds severed the main spar, and the bomber tumbled out of control toward the water below. During these attacks, Sweat's aircraft absorbed return fire from multiple sources. The bomber's rear gunners tracked him with their 7.7mm weapons, while anti-aircraft guns on the ships below filled the air with black puffs of exploding ordnance that shook his Wildcat with each near miss. A 20mm shell from a destroyer's gun battery punched a jagged hole in his left wing, and he felt the aircraft's handling characteristics change subtly as airflow disrupted by the damage affected his control surfaces. But he pressed the attack against a third bomber, then a fourth, each engagement following the same deadly pattern of approach, fire, and destruction. His ammunition counter showed less than half his original load remaining, and his engine temperature gauge was climbing toward the red line as combat maneuvering pushed the radial engine beyond normal operating parameters. Sweat soaked his flight suit despite the cold air at altitude, and his hands began to cramp from gripping the control stick during high G maneuvers. The Japanese formation was breaking up now. Individual bombers scattered across 20 miles of sky as they attempted to complete their attack runs while under continuous fighter attack. Some had already released their ordnance on targets of opportunity. Sweat saw geysers of water erupting around a Liberty ship as 250-kilogram bombs detonated just short of their target. But the concentrated attack the Japanese planners had envisioned was fragmenting into individual engagements where American defensive advantages began to tell. Radio chatter filled his headset with the controlled chaos of air combat, position reports, ammunition states, damage assessments, and the terse acknowledgments that marked successful attacks. Splash 1 Val, White 3 is Winchester. Taking fire from the north. Where's my wingman? The voices belonged to pilots he had trained with, eaten with, shared tents with. But in the adrenaline-soaked intensity of combat, they became disembodied reports from a battle that extended far beyond his individual field of vision. His fifth attack came against a Val that was beginning its bombing dive on a destroyer anchored near Tulagi's main wharf. The bomber was committed to its attack run, unable to maneuver defensively, presenting an almost stationary target for Sweat's guns. But the approach required him to dive through the concentrated anti-aircraft fire that rose from every Allied ship in the harbor, a curtain of steel that could destroy his aircraft as easily as enemy action. The fifth Val disintegrated under Sweat's guns as he pulled out of his attack dive at 800 feet above Tulagi Harbor, but his Wildcat was no longer the pristine fighter that had launched from Henderson Field 90 minutes earlier. The 20mm hole in his left wing had expanded into a ragged tear that extended from the leading edge nearly to the rear spar, and his oil pressure gauge showed a steady decline that meant his engine was bleeding vital lubricant through damaged lines. Worse, his ammunition counter registered less than 400 rounds remaining, enough for perhaps 2 more engagements if he exercised perfect fire discipline. Through his shattered windscreen, he spotted the second wave of Japanese bombers approaching from the northwest at 15,000 feet, a formation of at least 8 Vals flying in 2 4-plane diamonds. These bombers had observed the fate of their predecessors and were maintaining tighter formation discipline, their rear gunners already tracking his damaged Wildcat as it climbed laboriously toward an intercept course. The tactical situation had shifted decisively against him, low on ammunition, flying a damaged aircraft, and facing fresh enemy crews who had learned from watching the earlier engagement. Standard fighter doctrine called for disengagement under these circumstances. A prudent pilot would have turned southeast toward Henderson Field, nursing his wounded aircraft home while radioing for additional interceptors to engage the remaining bombers. But below him, the Liberty ship Robert Louis Stevenson was taking on survivors from a torpedoed destroyer, her decks crowded with wounded men who had no protection against diving bombers except the anti-aircraft guns that were already running low on ammunition after 40 minutes of continuous firing. Sweat made his choice with the same cold calculation that had driven his previous attacks. The Wildcat retained its structural advantages: 650 caliber machine guns that could destroy any Japanese aircraft they hit, armor plating around the cockpit, an engine that could absorb punishment, and self-sealing fuel tanks that would not explode from small caliber fire. His experience over the past hour had taught him the Aichi's vulnerabilities. The bomber's radial engine would fail catastrophically when hit by armor-piercing incendiary rounds, and its fixed landing gear created drag that prevented evasive maneuvering during attack runs. He positioned his aircraft 3,000 feet below and 2 miles behind the incoming formation, using the classic energy tactics that maximize the Wildcat's diving capability while minimizing exposure to defensive fire. The approach required precise timing. Too early, and the bombers would have time to maneuver defensively. Too late, and they would complete their attack dives before he could intercept them. His engine temperature gauge now showed red line readings as combat maneuvering and battle damage pushed the Pratt & Whitney radial beyond its design limits. But the power plant continued delivering thrust with the mechanical reliability that had made it the standard for American carrier aviation. The first bomber of the second formation filled his reflector gun sight at 600 yards range, the pilot maintaining steady course and altitude as his formation prepared for their bombing approach. Sweat opened fire at 400 yards, walking his burst from the Val's engine nacelle back through the cockpit area, where pilot and rear gunner sat separated by only a thin aluminum bulkhead. His remaining armor-piercing incendiary rounds punched through the bomber's structure with devastating effect, igniting fuel vapors and hydraulic fluid that turned the aircraft into a flying torch within seconds. But the return fire was immediate and accurate. The bomber's rear gunner, a naval aviation petty, officer named Hiroshi Tanaka, who had survived attacks on Port Moresby and Milne Bay, tracked Sweat's Wildcat with his Type 92 machine gun and fired a sustained burst that walked across the fighter's engine cowling. 7.7mm bullets, smaller than Sweat's 50 caliber rounds but fired with deadly precision, penetrated his oil cooler housing and severed additional hydraulic lines that controlled his landing gear and flaps. Sweat felt his aircraft's handling characteristics change immediately as oil pressure dropped towards zero and his engine began the characteristic rough running that preceded complete failure. Black oil streaked across his windscreen, further reducing his already limited forward visibility, and his cylinder head temperature gauge climbed rapidly as the engine lost its primary cooling system. He had perhaps 5 minutes of power remaining before the radial engine seized completely, leaving him with a 10,000-pound glider over 30 miles of open ocean. The second bomber in the formation was already beginning its attack dive on the Liberty ship below, and Sweat maneuvered for an intercept that would require him to fire through the concentrated anti-aircraft barrage rising from every Allied vessel in Tulagi Harbor. 20mm, 40mm, and 5-inch gun mounts filled the air with exploding ordnance that created a deadly curtain between sea level and 10,000 feet. Flying through this barrage meant accepting the risk that friendly fire might destroy his aircraft, but allowing the bomber to complete its attack meant condemning the men aboard the transport ship to probable death. His sixth kill came at the cost of severe additional damage to his Wildcat. The Val exploded in spectacular fashion when his remaining ammunition struck its bomb load, creating a fireball that briefly illuminated the entire harbor. But the explosion occurred close enough to Sweat's aircraft that metal fragments peppered his wings and fuselage. His radio went dead, cut off in mid-transmission as shrapnel severed the antenna cables, and several instrument gauges failed simultaneously as electrical systems shorted out. The third bomber presented a more difficult target, flying an evasive pattern that forced Sweat to maneuver aggressively despite his aircraft's deteriorating condition. His remaining ammunition, perhaps 60 rounds total, had to be expended with absolute precision. There would be no second chances, no opportunity to reposition for a better shot. He closed to point-blank range, less than 200 yards, where his 50 caliber bullets could not miss their target, but where the enemy rear gunner's 7.7mm weapon was equally effective. The engagement lasted less than 10 seconds, but consumed his final ammunition in 3 short bursts that set the bomber's starboard wing ablaze and sent it spiraling into Iron Bottom Sound. But Petty Officer Tanaka's final burst before his aircraft crashed had found its mark, punching several holes through Sweat's engine compartment and completely destroying his oil circulation system. His Pratt & Whitney radial began seizing immediately, its 18 cylinders grinding against each other without lubrication as internal temperatures soared beyond survivable limits. Sweat's seventh and final kill came not from gunfire, but from a ramming attack that epitomized the desperate nature of his situation. With his guns empty and his engine failing, he spotted the last bomber in the formation preparing to dive on a destroyer that was rescuing survivors from a previously sunken vessel. The tactical calculus was brutally simple. His aircraft was doomed regardless of his actions, but he could still prevent one more enemy bomber from completing its mission. He aimed his Wildcat's propeller at the Val's tail section and closed the final 100 yards at maximum speed, his dying engine delivering its last burst of power. The collision severed the bomber's empennage completely, sending both aircraft into uncontrolled spins that would end in the waters off Florida Island. But in those final seconds before impact, Sweat saw the last Japanese bombs fall harmlessly into the harbor, their explosions sending up harmless geysers of water and coral sand instead of tearing through the hull of an Allied vessel packed with wounded men. His Wildcat hit the water at nearly 200 miles per hour, the impact driving him forward against his shoulder harness with enough force to crack 2 ribs and render him briefly unconscious. The aircraft sank quickly in the deep waters east of Tulagi, its weight carrying it toward the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound, where it would join hundreds of other aircraft and vessels that had been lost during 8 months of continuous combat. But Sweat regained consciousness before the cockpit filled completely with water, and his survival training took over as he fought to escape the sinking fighter. The canopy mechanism had jammed on impact, trapping him inside the rapidly flooding cockpit as the Wildcat settled nose first toward the bottom. Salt water rose to his chest, then his neck, forcing him to tilt his head back to find the last pocket of trapped air. His hands worked frantically at the canopy release mechanism, feeling for the emergency jettison handle that would blow the plexiglass clear of the aircraft frame. When he finally found the lever and pulled it, the explosive charges fired with a muffled thump that sent the canopy spinning away into the blue-green depths. He kicked free of the sinking aircraft and began swimming toward the surface 40 feet above, his waterlogged flight suit and boots making each stroke a struggle against exhaustion and the weight of equipment designed for aerial combat rather than maritime survival. His ribs sent sharp pains through his chest with each breath, and salt water burned in cuts across his face where windscreen fragments had found their mark during the final engagement. But he could see sunlight filtering down from above, and the knowledge that Allied patrol boats were already searching the crash site gave him strength to continue swimming upward toward rescue and survival. Sweat's head broke the surface of Iron Bottom Sound at 12:47 hours, gasping salt water from his lungs as he fought to stay afloat in the gentle swells that rolled across the channel between Tulagi and Florida Island. His waterlogged flight suit dragged at his limbs with every movement, and his leather flight boots had filled with water that added 20 pounds to his already exhausted body. Around him, debris from the air battle floated on the oil-slicked surface, fragments of aluminum wing panels, pieces of plexiglass canopy, and the distinctive yellow life rafts that Japanese aircrew carried for emergency ditching. The immediate danger was not drowning, but hypothermia, as the tropical waters that seemed warm from the air could leach body heat with deadly efficiency over extended exposure. A PT boat's engines grew louder from the direction of Tulagi Harbor, the distinctive rumble of Packard Marine engines running at high speed. PT-109, commanded by Lieutenant Junior Grade Robert Lynch, had been dispatched to search for downed aircrews as soon as the air raid ended, following standard rescue protocols that had evolved during 8 months of continuous combat operations. The boat's crew included a Navy hospital corpsman trained in treating combat injuries, and their standing orders were to recover any Allied aircrew within 30 minutes of ditching, before shock and exposure could prove fatal. Lynch spotted Sweat's head bobbing among the debris field and maneuvered his PT boat alongside the exhausted pilot, while 2 enlisted men hauled him aboard with the practiced efficiency of a crew that had performed this rescue dozens of times. Sweat's first coherent words were a request for casualty reports from his squadron, followed immediately by questions about the effectiveness of his attack against the Japanese bomber formation. Even in his exhausted state, his mind remained focused on the tactical results of the engagement rather than his personal survival. Hospital Corpsman, Second Class. William Martinez began his medical assessment while the PT boat raced back toward Tulagi at 30 knots, its planing hull skipping across the swells with the jarring impacts that characterized high-speed runs in choppy water. Sweat's injuries were extensive but not immediately life-threatening. 2 cracked ribs from the crash impact, multiple lacerations on his face and hands from windscreen fragments, and the early stages of shock that followed prolonged exposure to combat stress and cold water. Martinez administered a morphine injection for pain management and wrapped the worst cuts with sulfa powder-treated bandages, that would prevent infection in the tropical environment. The preliminary debriefing began even before they reached shore, as Lynch recognized the intelligence value of Sweat's first-hand observations of Japanese tactics and aircraft performance. The pilot's account was remarkably detailed and tactically precise, describing the bomber formation's defensive measures, the effectiveness of different attack angles against the Aichi aircraft, and the coordination between Japanese fighters and bombers during the engagement. His estimate of 7 confirmed kills seemed conservative, given the number of aircraft he had observed exploding or crashing into the Sound, but Lynch knew that intelligence officers would require corroborating evidence before officially crediting aerial victories. At Tulagi's main wharf, a jeep ambulance waited to transport Sweat to the 42nd General Hospital, a collection of Quonset huts and field tents that served as the primary medical facility for Allied forces in the Central Solomons. The hospital had been treating combat casualties since August 1942, and its staff had developed expertise in the specific injuries that resulted from air combat, burns, blast trauma, decompression injuries, and the complex fractures that occurred when aircraft crashed at high speed. Dr. Captain James Morrison, the hospital's chief surgeon, had treated more than 400 aircrew casualties and could assess the severity of flight-related injuries within minutes of examination. Morrison's evaluation confirmed Martinez's field diagnosis while revealing additional complications that were not immediately apparent. Sweat's ears showed signs of barotrauma from rapid altitude changes during combat maneuvering, and his nervous system exhibited the hypervigilance and startle responses that characterized acute combat stress reaction. More concerning were indications of mild concussion from the crash impact, requiring observation for potential intracranial bleeding or swelling that could prove fatal if undetected. The standard treatment protocol called for 72 hours of bed rest, regular neurological evaluations, and complete prohibition of flight duties until all symptoms resolved. While Sweat underwent medical treatment, the intelligence assessment of his combat performance proceeded with the methodical thoroughness that characterized American military analysis. Lieutenant Colonel Samuel Moore, intelligence officer for the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing, interviewed every available witness to the engagement, including radar operators who had tracked the air battle, anti-aircraft gunners who had observed the bomber attacks, and surviving crew members from ships that had been targeted by Japanese aircraft. The preliminary evidence supported Sweat's claim of 7 enemy aircraft destroyed, making him the first pilot in Marine Corps history to achieve ace status on his initial combat mission. The broader tactical picture emerged through radio intercepts, photo reconnaissance, and reports from coast watchers positioned throughout the Solomon Islands chain. Operation I-Go had committed approximately 160 Japanese aircraft to the attack on Tulagi, representing nearly half of Admiral Yamamoto's available air strength in the South Pacific. The raid had achieved minimal strategic results. 1 transport ship sunk, 2 destroyers damaged, and minor destruction to shore installations, while losing at least 27 aircraft to American defenders. The unfavorable exchange ratio demonstrated that concentrated air attacks against well-defended targets were becoming prohibitively expensive for Japanese forces already stretched thin across multiple combat theaters. Sweat's individual contribution to this defensive victory was tactically significant but strategically symbolic. His 7 confirmed kills represented roughly 25% of total Japanese losses during the engagement, achieved by a single pilot flying alone against overwhelming odds. More importantly, his aggressive attacks had disrupted the coordinated bomber formations the Japanese tactics required for maximum effectiveness. By forcing enemy aircraft to break formation and defend themselves individually, he had transformed a concentrated air attack into a series of individual engagements where American advantages in firepower and aircraft durability became decisive factors. The news of Sweat's achievement spread rapidly through Allied forces in the South Pacific, carried by the informal communication networks that connected combat units across thousands of miles of ocean and jungle. Radio operators passed the story along with their routine message traffic, transport pilots carried it between bases, and hospital corpsmen shared it with wounded men who needed proof that individual courage could still influence the outcome of modern warfare. The psychological impact was immediate and measurable. Morale reports from throughout the theater showed marked improvement as news of the victory reached combat units that had been fighting defensive battles for nearly 2 years. On April 10th, 72 hours after the engagement, Sweat was cleared for limited duty and reported to VMF 221's operations tent for his formal intelligence debriefing. The session lasted 6 hours and produced a 37-page report that would influence American fighter tactics throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. His detailed observations of Japanese bomber defensive formations led to modifications in standard attack procedures, while his analysis of the Wildcat's performance against the Aichi aircraft provided valuable data for aircraft designers working on next-generation fighters. The most significant revelation from his debriefing concerned the psychological aspects of aerial combat. Sweat's ability to maintain tactical focus during extended high-stress engagement contradicted prevailing theories about combat effectiveness, degradation under extreme conditions. His performance suggested that intensive training combined with clear tactical objectives could enable individual pilots to achieve results far beyond statistical predictions based on aircraft performance and numerical odds. Colonel Moore's final assessment, forwarded to Marine Corps headquarters in Washington, recommended Sweat for the Medal of Honor while noting broader implications for fighter pilot training and tactical doctrine. The recommendation emphasized that Sweat's achievement resulted not from reckless heroism, but from disciplined application of sound tactical principles under extreme pressure. This distinction was crucial for military planners seeking to develop training programs that could produce similar results among other pilots facing comparable combat situations. The formal award process would require months of bureaucratic review, during which Sweat returned to flying combat missions with a squadron that now regarded him with the mixture of respect and wariness reserved for men who had demonstrated extraordinary capabilities under fire. His aircraft was a replacement Wildcat identical to the one he had lost, but his status within the squadron had changed fundamentally. He was no longer the untested rookie, but the proven combat veteran whose tactical judgment carried weight in mission planning sessions. On April 23rd, 16 days after his first combat mission, Sweat received orders transferring him to the Naval Hospital at Auckland, New Zealand, for medical evaluation and extended recovery. The official reason was treatment of persistent headaches and inner ear damage from his crash, but the underlying purpose was to remove him from combat operations while the Medal of Honor recommendation worked its way through military bureaucracy. The Marine Corps had learned from previous wars that heroes were valuable propaganda assets, and losing a Medal of Honor recipient to routine combat missions created public relations problems that outweighed tactical considerations. The flight south aboard a Douglas R-4D transport took 8 hours, crossing 1,500 miles of Pacific Ocean that had been contested territory just months earlier. Sweat occupied a litter berth alongside 17 other wounded Marines, most of them casualties from the ongoing operations in New Georgia, where American forces were preparing to assault Japanese positions at Munda Airfield. The contrast between his single day of combat and their months of jungle warfare struck him with uncomfortable force. These men had earned their wounds through sustained fighting in conditions that tested human endurance beyond normal limits, while his brief moment of glory had lasted barely 20 minutes. At Auckland General Hospital, Navy doctors conducted extensive neurological testing that revealed the full extent of his crash injuries. High-speed impact with water had caused microscopic bleeding in his inner ear, affecting his spatial orientation and balance in ways that made him unsuitable for immediate return to flight status. The concussion had been more severe than initial assessment indicated, with symptoms that included intermittent memory lapses and difficulty concentrating for extended periods. Dr. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hayes, a specialist in aviation medicine, estimated 6 to 8 weeks of recovery time before Sweat would be medically cleared for combat operations. The enforced inactivity was almost unbearable for a pilot accustomed to daily flight schedules and the constant urgency of wartime operations. Sweat spent hours in the hospital library, reading technical manuals and intelligence reports that detailed ongoing combat operations throughout the Pacific Theater. VMF 221 had been re-equipped with Vought F-4U Corsair fighters during his absence, and the squadron was participating in strikes against Japanese positions on Bougainville as part of the broader Solomon Islands campaign. His replacement pilot, 2nd Lieutenant Charles Lanphier, had already been credited with 3 confirmed kills flying the missions that should have been Sweat's. On May 18th, 41 days after his first combat mission, Sweat learned that his Medal of Honor recommendation had been approved by the Secretary of the Navy and forwarded to President Roosevelt for final authorization. The news arrived via coded radio message from Marine Corps headquarters, transmitted through the secure communications network that connected Allied commands throughout the Pacific. Along with personal congratulations from Commandant Thomas Holcomb, the message included orders returning him to the United States for the award ceremony and subsequent assignment to training duties at Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California. The voyage home aboard the hospital ship USS Repose took 14 days, calling at ports throughout the South Pacific to collect wounded personnel bound for stateside medical treatment. Sweat shared quarters with Major Gregory Boyington, the commanding officer of VMF 214, who had been shot down over Rabaul and captured by Japanese forces before escaping during a prisoner transport. Boyington's combat record included 22 confirmed kills over 6 months of operations, making him one of the most successful Marine fighter pilots in the Pacific theater. Their conversations during the long Pacific crossing revealed the psychological complexities that separated successful combat pilots from those who failed to adapt to the demands of aerial warfare. Boyington had observed that peak performance in fighter combat required a specific combination of technical skill, tactical awareness, and emotional detachment that allowed pilots to function effectively under extreme stress. Most aviators possessed adequate technical abilities, but few could maintain tactical focus while accepting the high probability of their own death during each mission. Sweat's case represented an unusual variant in this psychological profile. His performance on April 7th had demonstrated exceptional tactical capability, combined with calculated risk acceptance that bordered on fatalistic determination. Rather than being paralyzed by fear or driven to reckless aggression, he had maintained analytical clarity throughout an engagement that should have overwhelmed his decision-making capacity. Boyington theorized that this represented a rare but potentially trainable mental state that could significantly improve combat effectiveness among fighter pilots if properly understood and replicated. The Medal of Honor ceremony took place on October 5, 1943, in the Oval Office of the White House, with President Roosevelt personally presenting the award to Sweat in the presence of Marine Corps leadership and selected members of Congress. The citation read in part that First Lieutenant Sweat had unhesitatingly hurled his 4-plane division into action against a formation of 15 enemy bombers and personally destroyed 7 hostile planes during his flight's valiant 20-minute attack against overwhelming odds. The language was formally heroic, but failed to capture the tactical precision and sustained decision-making that had characterized his actual performance. Following the ceremony, Sweat was assigned to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro as an instructor pilot responsible for training replacement fighter pilots bound for Pacific theater operations. The assignment represented standard military practice of using combat veterans to transfer tactical knowledge to inexperienced aviators, but it also removed him from operational squadrons where his celebrity status might create morale problems among pilots who had not achieved similar recognition. His primary responsibility was developing curriculum that incorporated lessons learned from recent combat operations, particularly techniques for attacking heavily defended bomber formations. The training program that emerged from Sweat's combat experience emphasized aggressive tactics that exploited the Corsairs' superior firepower and diving capability against Japanese aircraft. Students learned to identify bomber formations' defensive weaknesses, calculate optimal attack angles for maximum effectiveness, and maintain tactical discipline during extended engagements where ammunition conservation determined survival. Most importantly, they practiced decision-making scenarios that required immediate tactical choices under simulated combat stress. By January 1944, Sweat had trained over 200 replacement pilots, many of whom were subsequently assigned to Pacific theater squadrons, where they applied his tactical methods against Japanese air forces that were becoming increasingly desperate as American industrial production overwhelmed their capacity to replace losses. Intelligence reports from combat zones indicated that pilots trained in Sweat's methods were achieving significantly higher kill ratios than previous replacement groups, validating the systematic approach to transferring combat experience through formal instruction. His personal combat record resumed in March 1944 when he was assigned to VMF 221 aboard the aircraft carrier USS Bunker Hill for operations against Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands. Flying the Corsair, he found the aircraft's performance characteristics ideally suited to his aggressive tactical style, with superior speed and firepower that allowed him to engage enemy aircraft on more favorable terms than the Wildcat had provided. Over the following 18 months, he flew an additional 99 combat missions, bringing his total to 103 sorties with 15.5 confirmed kills. The final phase of his wartime service included participation in the Okinawa campaign, where Marine fighter squadrons provided close air support for ground operations against the most heavily fortified Japanese position in the Pacific. The tactical environment had evolved dramatically since his first combat mission over Tulagi. American forces now possessed overwhelming numerical and technological advantages, while Japanese resistance had shifted from offensive operations to desperate defensive actions designed to inflict maximum casualties on attacking forces. Sweat's last confirmed kill occurred on June 18, 1945, when he shot down a Kawasaki Ki-61 fighter that was attempting to attack American landing craft near Okinawa's southern beaches. The engagement lasted less than 30 seconds and required only a single burst from his .650 caliber machine guns, reflecting both his improved marksmanship and the deteriorating quality of Japanese aircrew training, as experienced pilots were killed faster than replacements could be adequately prepared. The tactical situation bore no resemblance to his first mission 26 months earlier, when individual American pilots faced overwhelming odds against professionally trained enemy aircrews operating first-line aircraft. The war ended on August 15, 1945, while Sweat was stationed at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point, North Carolina, preparing for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan. His final wartime assignment was developing tactical doctrine for close air support operations against heavily fortified positions, work that would have been crucial for the anticipated ground campaign, but became academic when Japan surrendered following the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The sudden conclusion of hostilities left him, like thousands of other career military officers, facing an uncertain future in a peacetime military that would be dramatically reduced in size and mission scope.